Okay, so our presentation was a replication study on using goal setting and feedback to increase weekly running distance. It was a study done by Keisha Gray, Megan Smith, Rachel Erickson, and Amber Lee Kavanaugh. So for our literature review, we did a study. There was a study conducted by Louis Selly and colleagues that examined the effects of goal setting, performance feedback, positive reinforcement, and video modeling on 2 young adults with cognitive disabilities who were training for the Special Olympics. The goal of both participants was to increase their sprinting time within their intervention. They had 5 conditions, which were goal setting, performance feedback, positive reinforcement, and video modeling. The intervention consisted of different variations of the aforementioned conditions. So phase 1 was goal setting and performance feedback. Phase 2 was goal setting, performance feedback, and positive reinforcement, and so on. The results of the study were that both participants were able to increase their sprint time, while one sprinting time increased greater with the video modeling. The other performed better without the video modeling, but both improved with the goal setting and the feedback. Similarly, a study conducted by Miller and colleagues used goal setting, performance feedback, and tangible reinforcements in the form of raffle tickets for prizes as a reward for increasing the number of steps taken at recess in the school setting. The participants were 18 children ages 5 to 8 years old. They were given pedometers, and the 18 participants were split into 2 groups. Before going out to recess, the groups set a goal for the total number of steps they wanted to achieve. After recess, their total was posted publicly on a dry erase board for the rest of the participants to see, and they were given feedback on the results. The results of this study were that goal setting alone did not increase their number of steps, but there was an increase in steps taken when goal setting was combined with performance feedback and self-monitoring, but the highest activity level was seen when the rewards were included.
Hayes and colleagues determined that the mechanism causing behavior changes in a self-reinforcement procedure was public goal setting. The purpose of that study was purely just to determine what was causing behavior to change when they were using a self-reinforcement procedure. So they used 20 females and 6 males ranging from ages 20 to 60. The average age was about 26 years old. Anyone who scored higher than a 3 on their reading passage was excluded from the study. And that was so that they could avoid having a ceiling effect with their goals. So that essentially they wouldn't be too good at reading. By the end of the study, they wouldn't be able to keep setting higher and higher goals. Each student was given a preferred edible and sorted into 4 different groups with the 5th control group. So these groups were comprised of different combinations of public or private goal setting and having self-consequation or no self-consequation. So for example, if you were in the public no consequation group, you would have to make your goal public or known to the researcher or a teacher. But no self-consequation meant that even if you did not reach your goal, you could still have your M&M. What they found was pretty interesting. They found that anyone who was in a public group doubled their score. And that was whether or not it was contingent on meeting their goals. As long as they were in a public group that made their goal known, they increased their scores faster than the other groups. Robston Ward concluded that publicly posting soccer players' goals was an effective intervention to increase soccer skills and drills. The purpose of this study was to see if public posting, goal setting, and oral feedback as an intervention package could improve 3 different behaviorally defined soccer skills. They had 3 middle-class females who had been playing soccer for at least 5 years. participate in this study. They posted these girls' goals publicly on a picnic table that was often used for water breaks, so the entire team could go and see what their goals were and if they had been meeting them. They found that all the participants had increased all 3 soccer skills and maintained their improvements.
In the article, The Effects of Goal Setting on Rugby Performance, Malelu 2006 examined if goal setting affects performance of rugby players. The experimental design used was an A/B pre- and post-test with 5 male rugby union players. The players' age ranged from 21 to 25 years old, and all were starters for a team who played in the National Collegiate Rugby Union Championship. The dependent variables were moves performed throughout a game, such as the number of ball carries, the number of tackles, successful kicks, and number of turnovers. The number of ball carries were defined as the number of instances of the player running yardage with the ball in hand. The number of tackles was defined as a player successful or failure of preventing the opposite team player from carrying the ball towards their end. Kicking was defined as kicking the ball out of hand from a player towards the outfield, and finally number of turnovers was defined as the amount of time a player steals the ball away from the opponent. The independent variable was goal setting, which consisted of 3 stages: goal determination, goal setting, and goal reviewing. For goal determining, the players started by picking an action that they would like to improve on. Then based on baseline goal setting was determined for the appropriate target performance. Finally, during goal reviewing, the researcher and the player would go over their goals 48 hours before a match. The results of the study indicated that all but one of the players performed above their goals. Results also indicated that improvement in moves was not due to playtime, but rather the intervention. Now, in the article Assessing and Increasing Physical Activity by Camp and Hayes 2012, they reviewed some interventions that would increase physical activity. They talked about ways to monitor participants, and they described mechanical instruments, which are things that you can wear that monitors your activity throughout the day, such as a heart monitor. They focused on 2 groups, though, mainly. The first group were for non-obese adults, which they wanted to see if their physical activity would increase by self-monitoring and self-management while playing exergames. Exergames, for those who don't know, are games you can exercise with, like Wii Sports. For the second group, there were 5 obese adults who used a similar treatment as the previous participants to see if they can increase their calories burned in a day. The results for both saw an increase in steps and an increase in daily calories burned with all participants due to the self-monitoring, goal setting, and feedback. Feedback was given through email, as the participants had to send their data through email. With results, self-management showed promising attributes, and also self-monitoring and goal setting were maintained after the treatment.
I think you're on mute, Keisha.
Sorry, yep.
Okay.
The original study was conducted by Wack, Croslin, and Miltenberger in 2014, titled Using Goal Setting and Feedback to Increase Weekly Running Distance. As stated in the title, the purpose of the original study was to increase running distance with goal setting and feedback. The participants were 5 healthy adult females who were college students that were interested in increasing their running distance. It was a multiple baseline design with an embedded changing criterion design for intervention 2, which will be discussed later. Materials for the study included the Nike Plus Sport Kit and the Nike Plus sensor. IOA data was collected by the participant and researcher by recording the date and distance ran taken from the website. At the end of the study, the participants completed a social validity questionnaire. Baseline was collected by each participant wearing a Nike Plus Sport Band and sensor. No goals were set at this time, and the baseline was collected for 2 to 4 weeks. Once baseline was collected, intervention 1 was implemented, which consisted of each participant setting a short-term goal or a distance that they wanted to complete with each running episode, and a long-term goal or the distance the participant wanted to run in one running episode by the end of the study. Participants ran a minimum of 3 times per week for intervention 1, and they were required to complete at least 2 runs at or above the criterion set in order to be able to increase their distance for the following week. If a participant did not meet the criterion set, she could choose to remain at the same criterion for the following week or lower the goal. Because all 3 participants failed to meet their criterion on several occasions, the authors of the study revised the setup and offered intervention 2 with all participants consenting on implementation. The difference with intervention 2 was that participants no longer set a daily goal, and instead they set a weekly goal. There was no minimum number of runs for intervention 2. They could run as many days as they wanted as long as they met their weekly goal. In order to increase their goal for the following week, participants needed to meet or exceed their goal for 2 weeks in a row. The results of the study were that all participants chose to switch to intervention 2, and at the end, all participants were able to increase their running distance.
Now, in our study, we wanted to answer 3 main research questions. Since this is a replication, we wanted to see if the results of the original study conducted by Wack and colleagues would be replicated in our study. So, as Keisha just mentioned, the results of the original study were that all participants increased their overall weekly running distance. So we wanted to see if for our participants, the use of goal setting and weekly feedback would also increase our overall weekly running distance. And lastly, we wanted to see what effect the transition from intervention 1 to intervention 2 would have on overall weekly running distance, if any.
The participants of this study were 4 females ranging in ages from 25 to 31 years old. Before beginning the study, a physical activity questionnaire was completed to determine the health level and rule out any injuries or health risks that might have interfered or exacerbated given the amount of running to be completed. So the sheets are there on the slide. The first one, which is at the bottom, was just a general questionnaire on if you ever feel certain pain anywhere in your body, if you're on any kind of medication, or if you feel that there's any reason that you shouldn't be engaging in any physical activity. And then the second one, which is also, both of them are NASM, which is National Academy of Sports Medicine. The second one at the top there just asks occupational questions on if you're sitting for extended periods of time or how often you need to do repetitive movements. The recreational questions were if you partake in any recreational activities or if you have any hobbies that you do. And then the bottom portion of it was just the medical questions on if you have any certain pain in your body, if you've ever had surgeries, or if you've ever been diagnosed with any sort of chronic diseases. So after completing the questionnaires, all females of the research study were decided to be active individuals who didn't have any of these problems. They engaged in numerous fitness regimes for minimal lengths of 30 minutes per session to maximum lengths of an hour and a half. The setting consisted of some participants running outdoors, some running indoors, and some participants chose to rotate through both of those.
So the original study used the Nike Plus sensor, which is a shoe insert. For us, it would have required us to not only buy the insert, but also the specific Nike shoe. So that wasn't really feasible for us. We decided to use the Nike Run Club app, which this is a screenshot from my phone. It was really great because it had many different dimensions of the running behavior that we could choose from. Obviously, though, for this study, we were looking at the distance. So here we would choose the distance setting. And some of the participants were able to use this nifty little setting as well that you could type in the goal for that session. So for this particular session, my goal was 3 miles, and it would audibly alert me as soon as I finished. It did used to have the feature of telling you when you were halfway through, but I turned that one off. This is what it would look like when you were running on a treadmill indoors. This represents a rest period when it stopped. Luckily, both indoor and outdoor runs were shown to be pretty reliable, though outdoor runs were more reliable than treadmill runs. Each type of run, indoor or outdoor, had a pace analysis, which is actually what we ended up using for IOA, and we'll go into more detail on that later. But we also use the WhatsApp app and Google Hangouts. We use Google Hangouts for our video conferences in order to fulfill our treatment fidelity checklist and make sure that we could set our goals and give feedback to one another.
We define running as an individual traveling distances by foot continuously at a rate faster than 15 minutes per mile or 4 miles per hour. Examples included running outdoors on the road, sidewalk, or trail, or running indoors on a treadmill or track. Non-examples included walking or hiking. A possible limitation with the original study that they didn't really specify if they took breaks or not throughout their running. For our study, if we took breaks, we would either stop the time and would restart it when we were ready to go, or as Megan mentioned, you would see a dip in our pace and minus that from our overall total pace.
My bad. Just like the original study, we had permanent product recording as well. We had these nice little graphs that were included with the NRC app. This was the pace analysis that Amber was referring to. For this app, it had to be running and strapped to our bodies, either with an arm strap or in our pockets. Otherwise, it would not take any distance data whatsoever. Part of the reason why outdoor runs were more reliable is because for some reason the app preferred outdoor runs, and that tended to be its original setting. So it would use GPS on your run. Whereas for treadmill runs, if it was accidentally set to an outdoor run, there was no GPS to take distance data on point A to point B. And so, for example, with Keisha, at one point she had, down here it said that she had been running for about 25 minutes and had only run half a mile, but her pace was fast. So there was only a few instances of unreliable data with indoor runs, but luckily we would have the treadmill data to back us up and correct the distance if that had happened. This is what the pace analysis would look like. So at this dip, you can see that the pace was still 10-minute mile. If it had been 15, we would have taken the distance from here to here and subtracted it for the IOA data. We also had other permanent products. We took pictures of ourselves with sweaty faces and red faces so that you could know we did actually do this, even though it was difficult during this semester.
The design of this replication study was similar to that of the original study. We began with a multiple baseline design across participants with an embedded changing criterion design, considering that all four participants of the study chose to switch to intervention 2. And like mentioned earlier, the participants chose to do intervention 2 in week 10. During intervention 1, participants made daily goals for 3 days per week in order to meet their weekly goal. These daily goals and outcomes are depicted in changing criterion design charts. During intervention 2, participants made an overall weekly goal with no limits on the amount of runs per week. Throughout the entire study, data was collected on each participant on the multiple baseline design charts.
So in our study, the participants were in baseline anywhere between 3 and 6 weeks. Weekly running, you could run as little or as often as you like. There was no intervention, no feedback given at this time. And we made our decisions on the transition to intervention based on stability in baseline. So as I mentioned earlier, goal setting and feedback were the interventions. In intervention 1, that meant setting daily goals that you had to meet at a minimum of 3 times a week, and then an overall weekly goal. We did transition into intervention 2 during week 10 after 3 out of 4 participants had missed at least one of their overall weekly goals. And so during this time, there was no need to run a minimum number of days as long as you were meeting your overall weekly goal. During the treatment, we would meet weekly and look at our written goals to determine if we had in fact met our goals. And we used Google Docs to track the information that we took, to track our data. So this is the Google Docs sheet that Megan had made up for us. In this column here, if you follow along with my arrow, you'll see session numbers 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. Those account for the 3 days that minimum runs that we had to do for each week. Now, you'll see some blank here. We were in baseline, so during that time, there was no minimum number of runs necessary. However, if you look in this column, when Amber jumped into intervention, that's where you'll start seeing miles per day in all 3 columns to total up to the weekly distance. We also used Google Docs to make some rough graphs. So in blue, you'll see each participant's baseline distance, and this is the overall weekly distance that you're seeing here. So it's all 3 of those daily runs added together. And then the red data points represent intervention. So again, overall weekly distance during intervention. And we used the Nike Run Club app and these documents to check our IOA.
For IOA data collection, researchers were paired up with participants and information was exchanged to allow each party to be able to sign into the other's NRC account. Each week, a run session was chosen and the researcher and participant subtracted any distance from the total distance ran that was slower than a pace of 15 minutes per mile. Shorter distances were then divided by longer distances to find the IOA percentage. For all sessions chosen, IOA percentages were 100% since the NRC app collected permanent product data. And on this next table, you can just kind of take a look at our IOA data collection. So on the top one there for session 10.7, session 5.1, you'll notice that Megan did my IOA data for mine. And you can see that all of them are pretty much at 100% because it was just comparing the pace, and we had that permanent product data collection, which helped a great deal with our IOA collection.
All right, our participants committed to just using only the Nike Run Club app for the duration of the study. Also, we committed to not joining any running clubs or races during their intervention as well. Thus, the only intervention they received was weekly feedback and goal setting. Participants completed a treatment integrity yes/no checklist during each weekly feedback meetings. And the checklist consisted of, did you receive feedback on the distance you ran this week? Did you make a goal for next week's running distance? Was video conference held? Was your distance data presented and analyzed for the week? Did you document your goal? Was a permanent product shared during the video conference? The checklist is weighted for most important steps scored at 3 points and less important steps at 2 and 1 point, giving each treatment checklist a possibility of scoring 12 points. The checklist must have received fidelity score of 80% or higher to have been considered following treatment integrity. So if a fidelity score fell below 80%, a retaining meeting was held and treatment support goals were made. The average fidelity score was 95%, as you can see, and ranging from 50 to 100%. And only 3 scores fell below 80% out of 19 scores. Something to consider though, the 3 scores were in 1 week with all participants versus 3 separate weeks.
All right, let's talk about the results of our study. So we did a multiple baseline design across participants. And as I mentioned earlier, we used baseline stability to decide when to transition into intervention. So you'll see here, Keisha was our first participant to transition into intervention, as she had the most stable baseline data with a gradual increasing trend. Next, we had Amber, who was also fairly stable, a little dip down in week 4 here, but still consistent with running between 1 and 2 miles during baseline. Third was Rachel, or myself. I actually had a little bit of a gradual decreasing trend during baseline, but averaged around a mile. And last was Megan. There was some variability in her baseline, which is why she was the last to transition into intervention. However, she was also in baseline the longest, and later on we'll talk about some limitations that could have accounted for some of this variability as well. And it should be noted that when she hopped into intervention, she was actually the most stable of the bunch with the least variability in her intervention data. So let's look at each one of those participant graphs a little bit closer. Now, we already talked about Keisha's fairly stable baseline data. If we hop over to her intervention 1, this is where we were running 3 times per week at a minimum. She has an increasing trend line with 1 dip in week 8 due to only running 2 out of the 3 runs necessary, which is why you see this drop down here. Besides that though, the data does head in the same direction. And if you look at her baseline, her last baseline data point and her first intervention data point, we see about a mid-level magnitude of change going from about 4 miles per week during that last baseline run up to nearly 6 during that first intervention run. And then Keisha's data stays pretty stable between the first data point, first and only data points at the time of this presentation in intervention 2 and her intervention 1 last data point, both running about 9 miles per week. Next, we have Amber. In Amber's intervention, she also had a gradual increasing trend line. And comparably to Keisha, about a mid-level magnitude of change. She goes from running about 1 mile per week up to running closer to 3 miles a week as soon as the intervention began. We do see a little dip here in week 6, which can also be attributed to just not getting all 3 of those runs in. And then in intervention 2, there is a slight drop from about 4 miles back down to 3 miles overall. It's hard to say if this would, this trend would continue and that intervention 1 would be more successful for Amber, because at this time we only have 1 data point for intervention 2. So we would need more data to make any conclusions about that. This is Rachel. This is my graph. In baseline, relatively stable with a little dip down in week 3 where I did not run at all. But on average during baseline, I ran about 1 mile per week. I had the highest magnitude of change from baseline to that first intervention point, where I jumped from running about 1 mile per week up to running nearly 4. However, in week 7, I dropped down to 0 miles ran per week, and then head back up to about 4.5. So following these 3 data points, there is a very slight trend, increasing trend. And then my intervention 2 kind of follows along that same trend line where I'm running about 5 miles per week during that first week of intervention 2. Now, Megan, as we said earlier, had the most variability in baseline, but she was also in it the longest. Once she jumped into intervention, she had a mid-level magnitude of change, jumping from about 5 to 7 miles per week from baseline to intervention. And her increasing trend line is actually steeper than the rest of ours. And then in intervention 2, she has some overlap, sticking at right about 9 miles, just like her last data point in intervention 1. So if we look at these data statistics, we'll notice a few things. First, let's check out the variability in range. So with Megan's baseline variability, when we look at that, she went from running anywhere from 0 miles per week up to 5.78 miles per week. So a fair amount of variability in that range. Now in intervention, I was the one with the most variability because at week 7, I ran 0 miles, jumping up to 4.56 miles during intervention 1. All of us had significant change in our overall average weekly running distance. We'll start with Keisha. She went from running 4.08 miles on average during baseline to running 7.45 miles on average during intervention. Amber jumped up to 3.32 miles per week compared to 1.28 miles per week in baseline. I jumped up from just about 1 mile during baseline to just over 3 miles during intervention. And Megan had the biggest change in her average weekly distance with 3.9 miles during baseline as an average and doubling up to 8.02 miles on average per week during intervention. Now, I would like everybody to note that intervention 2 is not included on this table. At the time of this presentation, we only had 1 data point, so there was not enough data to calculate any mean, median, or range because we only had 1 as we just entered intervention 2 during week 10.
The original study had several limitations. Am I on? I can't tell. It won't let me go up. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
So one of the confounding variables was illness, and this was actually the #1 reason for variability in our study. We also had participants mention menstrual cycle as part of the reason why their distance or meeting their distance goals was affected because of fatigue or discomfort. Another big one that we were pretty surprised the original study had not controlled for was the location of runs. So if you had run outside, there was different inclines with hills, or running on a track or a treadmill with no incline. For me, for example, I started running outside when I was in baseline, and I had plenty of hills that I had to go up and down. And unfortunately, it got cold right when I switched into intervention, which means I also switched to my treadmill. So that definitely could have been a confounding variable since I did not have incline on my treadmill. Some other confounds that could have been control agents are things like using the running coach, which was available on the Nike Run Club app, competing in races, or running with a buddy. There was an instance with Amber. She had already previously planned to compete in a 10K race before we had chosen this study. And unfortunately for her, we had concluded that it would be too much of a confound and that she could not count the distance ran for that race towards this study. But we did use upbeat and fast-paced music, as well as some of us using podcasts and TV shows while running on treadmills. This could have also been a limitation. Another limitation for Amber specifically was the fact that she is in Canada running kilometers instead of miles. So she had to convert the distance, as well as the fact that when she was running, she was looking at a higher number than any of us. So for I think it was like 3 or 4 miles, she was looking at 8 kilometers or 10 kilometers, and so it kind of was more of a mental game. So we also felt like the real independent variable was more social accountability than just goal setting and feedback. If we had not had to answer to one another every Monday and know that we were going to look over our permanent product data and make our graphs and whatnot, we all realized that we may not have reached our goals had we not have had to answer to one another. And this is in concordance with Hayes and Brops and Ward's 2 studies that said that public goal setting was the control agent for self-reinforcement or goal setting. So for future applications, we would suggest saying that the independent variable is public goal setting and feedback specifically. We would also say that future applications would benefit from alternating treatment designs between public and private goal setting. And we would definitely say that it needs to be systematically controlling for confounding variables discussed over here.
All right, so this is still an ongoing study. All of the participants are still actively running in intervention 2, working towards our overall weekly goals. So these are all preliminary conclusions from the data that we have at this time. So let's talk about those research questions from our purpose of our study. Replication of results. In the original study, the participants did increase their overall weekly running distance once the introduction of goal setting and feedback was introduced. And so far, we are also seeing that. If we think back to the average overall weekly running distance that I spoke about a couple minutes ago, all of our participants increased their overall weekly running distance during intervention. And since that has happened right now, we can say that there is a functional relationship. The intervention did, in fact, change the dependent variable of our overall weekly running distance by increasing it in some cases almost double to that of baseline. And the effects of the intervention switch, we are unable to make any conclusions about this at this time. Again, that's because we only have 1 data point in intervention 2. We did see a little dip in Amber's data during intervention 2. However, we don't have enough information to know if that trend would continue or if she would hop back up in the continuing weeks. So we'll have to stand by on that one and continue to run and take data to establish what the effects of that intervention switch actually are. But we can say that goal setting and feedback at this point have increased all participants' overall weekly running distance.
All right, here's our references, and that is the end of our presentation. Thank you for listening, everyone.